This recording has been released into the public domain by the Bahnsen Institute, where we aim to bring into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ.
Should argue with an atheist and expect to win. Three things need to be said by way of preface before we get into the actual substance of determining the argument that we will use. And by these three introductory remarks, which will take a few minutes, but they still are intended to be introductory, I'd like to indicate the nature of the project that we set out to accomplish, what we're doing. I want to indicate the nature of the task that we're involved in as we're arguing with the atheist. And to put it very simply, or in summary, we are aiming to show the objective truth of the Christian system of thought as a whole. We are aiming to show the objective truth of the Christian system of thought as a whole. And I'm going to make 3 points about that and then summarize with that very same remark, and I hope you understand it better after I analyze it a bit. In the first place, we need to make it very clear that what we are defending is not some kind of general theism, but it's Christian theism in particular. Very often, I think philosophers of religion who are Christians and intending to defend the Christian faith ultimately make the mistake of thinking that they must begin at a broader position than just Christianity. They need to defend just the broad idea of there being a God, somewhere, somehow. That isn't the approach that the presuppositionalist takes. Natural theologians may think it's all right to argue for a God, or God in general, whatever that would be. But according to the presuppositionalists, we are defending the Christian conception of God. It is not any other religion of the world or any other concept of God or the lowest common denominator among all the religions of the world, of which there is none, by the way, but it's not some generalized idea, but rather it's Christian theism that we're defending. Second point, by way of introduction, and that's that we are defending the objective truth of the Christian faith, and we believe we are offering an objective proof of that truth. All right, so it's the objective truth of the Christian faith that we are offering, not subjective relativism. You know, the thing that is so commonly heard in our day, the idea, well, that's true for you, but it's not true for me. Or maybe that's, you might say to somebody, well, I found Christianity to be true for me. It may not be true for you, but it is true for me. And we need to recognize that that is just philosophical gobbledygook. This idea of true for you, true for me, is utterly senseless. Truth is not person relative. It won't make any difference if I say, our car is parked in the parking lot. Well, that's true for me, but it may not be true for you. I mean, the car is in the parking lot, or it's not in the parking lot, and that's all there is to it. Often, I think when people speak this way, relativistically, as though matters of religious importance can be true for one person and not for another, what they're really saying is either I believe it to be true, but you don't, or they mean I have found it to be satisfying, but you haven't. And of course, believing something is a far shot from it being true. People every day find themselves believing things that are not true. And so, if we simply mean to say, I believe it, but you don't, or you believe it and I don't, then we shouldn't be saying it's true for you, it's not true for me, and using expressions like that, we should simply say, I believe it to be true, but you don't believe it to be true. If we are talking about who has had subjective satisfaction with, say, the Christian faith or Buddhism or whatever we're talking about, that too has nothing to do with whether it's true, because a person can be satisfied with a false hypothesis. You know, if you have somebody that is dying, and you go in and you tell them, it looks pretty good, you're going to pull out of this situation, you may give that person a sense of hope and satisfaction and peace. But that doesn't mean that medically the condition is going to change. So then, the feeling of peace and satisfaction is irrelevant to the truth of any religious claim. We are not, as Christians, offering then true for me, and I hope it proves to be true for you. We're saying it's true for everybody, whether you like it or not. Dr. Van Til from Westminster Theological Seminary, who is perhaps the leading writer in presuppositional apologetics in our century, had this to say about the offering of an objective argument for Christianity over against subjective relativism. He says, people may argue against Christian apologetics, and they'll say something like this: while a Christian can prove that his Christian position is fully as reasonable as the opponent's view, there is no such thing as an absolutely compelling proof that God exists or that the Bible is the Word of God, just as little as anyone can prove its opposite. All right. Van Til poses that that's an objection somebody may give, and he replies with these words: in this way of putting the matter, there is a confusion between what is objectively valid and what is subjectively acceptable to the natural man. It is true that no method of argument for Christianity will be acceptable to the natural man. Moreover, it is true that the more consistently Christian our methodology, the less acceptable it will be to the natural man. A patient may like a doctor who tells him that his disease can be cured by means of external applications, and may dislike the doctor who tells him that he needs a major internal operation. Yet the latter doctor may be right in his diagnosis. It is the weakness of the Roman Catholic and the Arminian methods that they virtually identify objective validity with subjective acceptability to the natural man. Distinguishing carefully between these two, the Reformed apologist maintains that there is an absolutely valid argument for the existence of God and for the truth of Christian theism. He cannot do less without virtually admitting that God's revelation to man is not clear. It is fatal for the Reformed apologist to admit that man has done justice to the objective evidence if he comes to any other conclusion than that of the truth of Christian theism. What Van Til says here is that the argument that he is proposing as a presuppositionalist is objectively valid. The argument is good, it is sound, it ought to convince people whether they are convinced or not. It offers demonstrable proof of God's existence. And not just, well, this argument indicates that it's true for me. All right, let me go on to my third introductory point. Not only are we defending Christian theism and not simply theism in general, and not only are we defending it as objectively true, not just subjectively satisfying or acceptable, but we are presenting Christianity as a system of thought. A system of thought. If you're going to be defending the Christian faith, it will be crucial for you to indicate to people that you are not defending Christians, you're defending that system of thought that they adhere to. You know, for the most part, when people have something to say contrary to the Christian faith based on Christians, there's usually very little you can say, except that Christians do sin, Christians are inconsistent, and there are some hypocritical Christians, to be sure. Christians have done embarrassing things in history, and when people cite those things, all I can say is, if what you're saying is true, then it was contrary to the Christian faith. It wasn't in terms of the Christian faith that they did that. So let's make it clear as we're presenting our argument for Christian theism, that it's Christian theism as a system of thought and not Christians as persons that we are aiming to defend. So those 3 points then. Christian theism as an objective truth and a system of thought. What I said at the beginning, and I'll use this to conclude now my introduction, is that the nature of our project is to show the objective truth of the Christian system of thought as a whole. Not Christianity in bits and pieces, but Christianity as a worldview, as an outlook on life. And with that in mind then, how shall we argue with the atheist? The atheist is going to demand evidence for the objective truth that God exists, the Christian God exists. And I think the atheist should. I don't believe it's right for people to believe things arbitrarily. In fact, the whole task of philosophy, it seems to me, is to examine our beliefs and see which ones do have good support and which ones are simply arbitrary or mistaken. One of the things a study of philosophy should do is that it should enable you to weed through the things you believe and find out which of them is true. And so, when the atheist asks for evidence for the existence of God, he's asking the right things. But immediately we have a problem. What is the nature of the evidence that is needed to prove a Christian God? We're going to have to determine the nature of the evidence in this particular case. And we'll have to do so first because the existence of God is not a garden variety issue. You may have noticed that. Somebody may wonder whether there are 14 pink cars in the city of Portland at present. Well, that's a little bizarre question to ask, but it's a garden variety type of question to settle. I mean, we know what we'd do in order to settle that question. We know how we would look, what we'd count as evidence, and we could send out the people to do their survey and come back with an answer. That would be a garden variety issue. But when we ask about the existence of God, we are not dealing with garden variety issues. We have to recognize that there are different kinds of things that exist. And the evidence for those different kinds of things will differ just because they are different kinds of things. The evidence that one asks for to prove that there's a rose in the garden is not the same kind of evidence one asks for to prove that there are quasars. Nor is the evidence for roses in the garden or quasars anything like the evidence one might demand to show that so-and-so loves you. I mean, is love real? Does that exist? Are roses real? Are quasars real? When somebody says, I want you to prove to me that there are quasars, and you try to offer evidence that would be similar to what you would do if you were proving that there is love, you see, you've missed the point. The evidence for an existence claim must be adjusted and is in fact determined by the nature of the existence that you're trying to prove. And so, when we think about proving the existence of God, we must remember God is not a natural object. You can't prove the existence of God like you can prove the existence of Crater Lake. You don't prove the existence of God in the same way you'd prove the existence of electricity. So, with that in mind, what kind of evidence would you be looking for to prove the existence of God? As you're thinking about, remember also that when you're talking to the unbeliever, talking to the atheist, we mustn't think that either one of us is neutral about this question. Anybody who pretends to be neutral, to be open-minded, to be uncommitted, is doing just that, pretending. They may be deceiving themselves. They may, in all sincerity, think that they really are open to it. But we know from the Bible, and I can assure you from my experience, and I think you would see it in your own experience too, no one is completely neutral. The way in which the nature of evidence is determined for the existence of God already says something about a person's metaphysical convictions. That's a word that you probably don't use very often. You go to the store, the clerk doesn't say, well, what kind of metaphysical views do you have today? What is metaphysics? Metaphysics is that area of philosophy that studies the nature, structure, and origin of what is real or what exists. Metaphysics asks whether there are angels, whether causality is true of the world, whether that accurately describes the way things happen in the world. Metaphysics asks about whether there's a soul or a life after death, whether there is a God, whether men have free will. Questions such as these. And so what I'm saying to you is that when we look at the question, what kind of evidence will be demanded, one's metaphysical views are going to influence the answer to the question about the kind of evidence demanded. What one thinks about reality in the first place will determine what he accepts as evidence in the second. And I'm going to try to illustrate that. This is a bold venture. I know that I'm not dealing with a philosophical audience per se, but I'm going to try to illustrate that from the history of philosophy, looking at two schools of thought, one called rationalism and another called empiricism. Now, a leading exponent of rationalism was the philosopher Plato. Plato held that one can know something without the benefit of his senses. That people can know things in terms of their reasoning ability, and often enough, it seems in Plato, in terms of their intuitive ability. Nevertheless, apart from dependence on sensation, people can know things. However, you need to realize that Plato had a metaphysical view as well, that most people who disagree with him on his view about the nature of evidence did not hold. Plato held that there are such things as ideas or ideals or universals or forms of things. If you were to go out to the countryside and you saw cows out in the meadow, Plato would tell you that not only are there such things as Beauregard and Beulah out there, the cows that you see, but there is also a form or a universal of cowness in which Beauregard and Beulah participate. There is a non-physical, transcendent idea of cow. And no one ever comes into contact empirically, that is, in terms of their physical senses, with the idea of cowness. You may go out there and milk Beulah, but you'll never be able to milk the idea of cowness. You may run in to Beauregard with your car. Beauregard gets out on the highway, but you'll never run into the idea of cowness. See, the idea doesn't exist in this world. It's not even like anything in this world. It's non-physical. It's non-sensuous. And that's why I say it was known rationally or intuitively, according to Plato. Now, what I want you to put together here is the fact that Plato, when it comes to the nature of evidence, held that people could know things apart from their senses. He also held that there are things that exist, which are non-sensuous, and which are of a universal or class nature. Cowness would be defining the class of cows, if you will. Now, I'm going to go to the other school of thought that has dominated in the history of philosophy. It's called empiricism, and an example of an empiricist would be David Hume. David Hume was a Scottish philosopher in the 18th century who held that you cannot know things apart from your senses. All right? If we're going to know anything, we must have some basis in sensation to know it. In fact, Hume went so far as to say any idea that we have for which the constituent parts of that idea cannot be traced to a sensation, that idea is meaningless. All right? You've probably run into that kind of philosophy, or at least the espousal of that kind of philosophy, more in your experience than Plato's. The empiricist says, if you're going to prove anything to me, you've got to give me some sensation. You've got to give me either, I've got to see it, I've got to hear it, I've got to taste it, I've got to touch it. Or somebody has to have seen it, heard it, tasted it, touched it, whatever. Now, let me add something about David Hume's philosophy. David Hume also held that there is no such thing as a universal. There are no abstract ideas, said Hume. The only things which exist are particular in nature. And so, there is nothing like cowness in reality, although there may be cows. Now, Hume would go on to have problem with even identifying cows or a continuing self or causality and so forth. But what I want to have you remember is that Hume said there's no idea or abstract idea of cow. There's no universal, non-sensuous, transcendent thing that exists. The only things that exist are in this material world, and they are particular in nature. And now it's fascinating. If you go through the history of philosophy, you see that same correlation. One's metaphysical views seem to determine one's epistemological views. What you will accept in terms of evidence for existence claims is dependent upon what you believe exists. By the way, it works the other way around, too. I mean, I have lectures in which I try to demonstrate that those two things are mutually dependent upon each other. It's not necessarily that metaphysical views determine epistemological views, that is, views about what is real determine what you take as evidence, but it's just as true that what one takes as evidence and what a person thinks knowledge amounts to will determine his view of reality. These go together. Consequently, there is no neutrality. When somebody is going to answer the question as to the nature of evidence that is demanded in an argument, that person is going to reveal something about his or her worldview in general, his or her view of what is real. So the nature of evidence must itself be proven by one's metaphysical standards, one's presuppositions about what is real. Now, let's come back to the atheist and the theist arguing with each other. You see, as a theist, I would say to an atheist, there's plenty of evidence for God's existence. God has provided it everywhere. God has provided evidence in the stars of the heavens. God has provided evidence in the power of the seas and the beauty of the forest. God has provided evidence in the intricacy of the human body. God has provided evidence in the course of history. God has provided evidence in the work that he did in the lives of the Israelites. God has provided evidence in the life of his Son, in the miracles that were performed in his resurrection. God has provided evidence in the way that he judges nations. God has provided evidence in the Scripture, revealing himself there through the prophets and the apostles. God provides evidence when you look at the wonderful harmony of the Bible over many centuries, written by many men. God has provided evidence in the way that the Bible itself satisfies the deepest spiritual needs of people. God has provided evidence in the life-transforming power of the Bible. We could go on and on. See, as I see it, evidence is all around us. But you know what the atheist will say when I suggest there's plenty of evidence? The atheist will say, well, that's not evidence for God, because I have another explanation for all of those things. In fact, that can't be evidence for God if he is a naturalist or an atheist, because according to him, it's not possible to have evidence for God. If he is, in fact, a naturalist or an atheist in terms of his view of reality, then all of these things must be reinterpreted so that they are regimented or will conform to, will comport with that man's naturalism or atheism. An empiricist says, I don't believe anything unless you can offer evidence from the senses to me. And then I suggest, well, there are things that we know totally apart from the evidence of our senses. And then I give him an example. What do you expect the empiricist to do? Do you expect him to just fall down and say, oh, I guess I was wrong. There it is. There's the evidence. No, what the empiricist will tend to do is he'll say, no, you don't really know that. That's just delusion. That's just speculation. That's just imagination. He wants to reinterpret everything that I offer to him as a counterexample to his thesis. He wants to reinterpret it in terms of the truth of his thesis. By the way, theists do the same thing and rationalists do the same thing. That's just a characteristic of philosophical systems. Philosophical systems tend to exclude evidence and counterclaim to those evidence or counter-evidence to the system itself. The naturalist doesn't believe it's even possible to have evidence of the supernatural. His autonomy, therefore, his view that he is self-sufficient in his ability to understand the world and to explain it on naturalistic terms, can be considered a personal prejudice. Dr. Van Til, in his little pamphlet, Why I Believe in God, puts it this way. He says, you have insulted God, and his displeasure rests upon you. God and you are not on speaking terms. He's talking to the atheist here. And you have very good reasons for trying to prove that he does not exist. If he does exist, he will punish you for your disregard of him. You are therefore wearing colored glasses, and this determines everything you say about the facts and reasons for not believing in him. You have, as it were, entered upon God's estate and have had your picnics and hunting parties there without asking his permission. You have taken the grapes of God's vineyard without paying him any rent, and you have insulted his representatives who asked you for it. I must make an apology to you at this point, Van Til says. We who believe in God have not always made this position plain. Often enough we have talked with you about facts and sound reasons as though we agreed with you on what these really are. In our arguments for the existence of God, we have frequently assumed that you and we together have an arena of knowledge on which we agree. But we really do not grant that you see any fact in any dimension of life truly. We really think you have colored glasses on your nose when you talk about chickens and cows, as well as when you talk about the life hereafter. We should have told you this more plainly than we did, but we were really a little ashamed of what would appear to you as a very odd or extreme position. We were so anxious not to offend you that we offended our own God. But we dare no longer present our God to you as smaller or less exacting than he really is. He wants to be presented as the all-conditioner, as the emplacement on which even those who deny him must stand. Now, in presenting all your facts and reasons to me, you have assumed that such a God does not exist. You have taken for granted that you need no emplacement of the sort outside of yourself. You have assumed the autonomy of your own experience. And I want to repeat that. Bahnsen says you have assumed the autonomy of your own experience. Consequently, you are unable, that is unwilling, to accept as a fact any fact that would challenge your self-sufficiency. And you are bound to call that contradictory which does not fit into the reach of your intellectual powers. You remember what old Procrustes did. If his visitors were too long, he cut off a few slices at each end. If they were too short, he used the curtain stretcher on them. It is that sort of thing I feel that you have done with every fact of human experience. And I am asking you to be critical of your own most basic assumption. Bahnsen says, when we enter into the debate with an atheist, we must challenge him to look at that which he has taken for granted, that which reflects a personal prejudice against God. We want the atheist to be critical of his own most basic assumption, which is the autonomy of his own experience, that he can rationally, on his own, self-sufficiently, understand anything about the world. All right. How do we determine the evidence for God's existence? It turns out that the kind of evidence that we will accept or reject for God's existence will turn out to reflect our own attitude toward whether there is a God or not. Our metaphysical view will, as it were, ride roughshod over our epistemological commitments. What we believe about the nature of reality will in itself determine what we'll accept as evidence about things which are real, about things which exist or don't exist. And so we have to recognize that in every human being, Christian and non-Christian alike, there is something like a worldview that is a pre-commitment in their life. A worldview in which they coordinate their view of reality and their view of truth. What you take to be true and how things are proven is determined by your view of what is real and vice versa. And these two things together, one could add also a view of how we should live our lives, our ethics. These things together form a basic outlook on life, a worldview. And it is impossible to break apart the corresponding members of the worldview. It's impossible to separate out a person's view as to what counts as evidence as though that isn't going to be determined by a person's view of what is real or what is not real, what is possible, what is not possible. So that's the first general thing we're going to say tonight, that we're really arguing about worldviews then. We're not simply arguing about one particular question within a common worldview that we share with the unbeliever. We're really asking about the unbeliever's worldview and our worldview. The nature of evidence is going to be adjusted to our general outlook on life, our general view of man and his place in the universe, or whether there even is a universe for that matter. All right, second step in the development of how we should argue with an atheist is to see that the theistic question is a special question. The theistic question is metaphysically special, as I've already hinted to you, because God is a non-natural object. It's not like your rose in the garden. God is not even like electricity. God is a supernatural being, and as such, the evidence for God's existence and the way in which we argue for God's existence is not going to be just exactly like anything else we argue about. And epistemologically, as I just said, in terms of our theory of knowledge, or evidence, or truth, epistemologically, we've already seen that the argument is going to be presuppositional in nature. It's going to be about ultimate commitments people have, about general ways in which they look at the world and man and his place in the universe and how he knows things. All these things are going to be correlated in a worldview. So that the theistic question is a special kind of question and will not be settled in the way that just about any other dispute among philosophers and men is settled. The conflict between worldviews or presuppositions must be resolved somewhat differently than the conflict between factual claims within a worldview. Let me say that again. The conflict between worldviews must be resolved somewhat differently than the factual conflict within worldviews. All right. Assume that we share a general outlook on life. We have a common view of man, his reasoning powers, what counts for evidence, what can be real, what can't be real, and so forth. And then a question comes up. And the question is there such a thing as a baseball? Now, within a common worldview, we can set out to answer that question. There might be people who say, I don't think there is such a thing as a baseball. Another person says, no, I think there is such a thing as a baseball, and I'd like to give you evidence for it. Within a worldview, they can resolve that question. Within a worldview. They share common outlooks on reality, truth, evidence, so forth. They can determine whether there is or is not a baseball in this world. But you see, the argument between worldviews is going to be different than an argument within a worldview. The argument between a Buddhist and a Christian is going to be different than an argument between two Christians or two Buddhists. And slowly, by degrees, I'm trying to move you without getting into a lot of philosophical sophistication to see that the kind of argument we must engage in is not really very much like what the natural theologians are trying to do at all. Natural theologians assume that the unbeliever and the believer have all sorts of things in common, and they just differ on this one, we won't say little point, it may be spiritually important, but it's just one little point over here. It's as though the unbeliever has the same outlook on life, but there's one leg missing to his table. He has three legs, and the table's a little wobbly, and what the theist or Christian has is he has the fourth leg of the table. And what we need to do is just show him that he needs that fourth leg, and everything will be fine. That assumes the atheist and the theist are for the most part exactly alike philosophically, exactly alike psychologically or spiritually, and now we can resolve it as though it were just two people within the same worldview settling whether there are baseballs or not. But that isn't the case. And if I can get you to see that, then I think I can get you onto the right track as to what the kind of argument must be that you'll present when you want an objectively valid argument for the truth of the Christian system. We are arguing between worldviews. And what I want to stress is that the argument between worldviews must still be based on rational consideration. The fact that you have two worldviews facing one another in conflict doesn't mean we just start now depending on what makes us feel good. You see, I do know some Christians that have realized that you cannot resolve the issue of whether there's a God by depending upon the standards of your opponent, and yet you can't expect your opponent to accept your standards either. And so it's like we're at a kind of a stalemate, a standoff. And so we can't argue with one another. All we can do is either call names or try to persuade the person in terms of the nature of our life, or by appealing to subjective considerations like, well, it gave me peace of mind. No, I'm not taking that exit, that cop-out. I'm saying it is still in the realm of argumentation and reason that we must offer an argument for the existence of God. And yet the argument must be adjusted to, must be determined by the nature of the dispute, and that dispute is presuppositional in character. It is not a factual claim within a worldview. What is at stake is the worldview itself. A worldview that tells me how to interpret the evidence, how to use the laws of logic, how to personally find significance in terms of whatever is found to be true. The worldview guides a person in making those decisions. The atheist has his worldview, the theist has his worldview, and the two have come into conflict. Now, how do you resolve those problems? You can't directly appeal to facts, because the facts are going to be interpreted differently. You can't directly appeal to laws, because laws are interpreted differently. So what do you do? This brings me to the third portion of my presentation of the argument. And what I want to suggest is what you must do in that situation is you must offer a transcendental argument for the existence of God. A transcendental argument, that probably doesn't help you a whole lot. If I were to stop right there, you might skin me alive. Did we came out to hear this? What is a transcendental argument? Basically, a transcendental argument has to do with the preconditions of intelligible experience. That helps a little. I'm going to say more, though. The preconditions of intelligible experience. In the history of philosophy, I'm going to be real simplistic here. I've already told you there are people called rationalists who say we can know things apart from our senses. And there are people called empiricists who say we can't know things apart from our senses. Descartes was a rationalist. All right? Prime example of a school of thought called continental rationalism. Hume, as I already told you, was an empiricist, a prime example of what was called the school of British empiricism. Well, after Descartes and after Hume, another approach to metaphysical and epistemological questions came along in the person of Immanuel Kant. Kant was a transcendentalist. Kant asked after the preconditions of intelligible experience. And Kant said it's not a question of rational principles, like Descartes thinks, and it's not a matter of empirical experience, as Hume thinks, but rather something that goes behind both of those. What makes our empirical experience intelligible, and what gives substance to our laws of thought, or to our categories of thought? Kant said these must be brought together in terms of a more basic question about the preconditions of intelligibility. Now, I think Kant was exactly wrong as to how that's done. I'm not a Kantian by any means. I oppose him pretty stridently. However, what Kant was trying to do is exactly what must be done when worldviews are arguing. The only way we can resolve the question of which worldview is correct is by asking after the preconditions of intelligibility. To argue transcendentally, then, is to argue from the impossibility of the contrary. When I argue transcendentally with somebody, I'm saying that the worldview that I hold is such that if you don't have this worldview, the opposite is impossible. It's not intelligible. You cannot make sense of human experience apart from the presupposition that I'm using. Okay, I'm going to, for some of you especially that may be a little distressed with the vocabulary and difficult concepts, let me put it to you this way, and if you're taking notes, write this down, because I think this will clarify it for you. Go home and reflect on it. The proof of the Christian God is that without Him, you can prove nothing. The proof of the Christian God is that He's necessary for proving anything. The whole idea or concept of proof presupposes the Christian outlook on life. One more time. The proof of the Christian God, then, is that without Him you can prove nothing. God, or if you will, the Christian worldview, is the precondition of intelligibility. And when I say that, when I make that claim, I'm attempting then to argue from the impossibility of the contrary. Dr. Van Til explains what a presuppositional argument is using these words. He says it's an indirect rather than a direct form of argumentation. The method of reasoning by presupposition may be said to be indirect rather than direct. The issue between believers and non-believers in Christian theism cannot be settled by a direct appeal to facts or laws whose nature and significance is already agreed upon by both parties to the debate. The question is rather as to what is the final reference point required to make the facts and the laws intelligible. The question is as to what the facts and laws really are. Are they what the non-Christian methodology assumes that they are? Are they what the Christian theistic methodology presupposes they are? The answer to this question cannot be finally settled by any direct discussion of facts. It must, in the last analysis, be settled indirectly. The Christian apologist must place himself upon the position of his opponent, assuming the correctness of his method merely for argument's sake, in order to show him that on such a position the facts are not facts and the laws are not laws. He must also ask the non-Christian to place himself upon the Christian position for argument's sake, in order that he may be shown that only upon such a basis do facts and laws appear intelligible. To admit one's own presuppositions and to point out the presuppositions of others is therefore to maintain that all reasoning is in the nature of the case circular reasoning. The starting point, the method, and conclusion are always involved in one another. I recognize that beginning where I do with my outlook on life, I have an approach to the theory of knowledge, an approach to reality and to ethics, if we were to throw that into the hopper too, which are all connected with one another. Where I start an argument, the way I proceed in an argument, where I conclude, are all connected. And by the way, my opponent does the same thing. Now, I think Van Til may be a little loose in his use of vocabulary at this point. Many English readers will take him when he says, that's to say, all reasoning at this level is circular reasoning, to mean, well, every argument is God exists because God exists. That is not what he means. He means that every argument I offer you will in the end be found to presuppose the very thing I'm trying to prove. And every argument the atheist offers will in the end, upon analysis, show that he was assuming his conclusion as he went along also. Worldview arguments in the nature of the case must do that. So, Van Til says, what can we do? What's the only thing left to do? To ask which of these worldviews can make facts and laws of logic or what have you intelligible. We must argue from the impossibility of the contrary. So, I'm going to repeat. Without God, you cannot prove anything at all. In his pamphlet, Why I Believe in God, Van Til puts it this way. Now, in fact, I feel that the whole of history and civilization would be unintelligible to me if it were not for my belief in God. So true is this that I propose to argue that unless God is back of everything, you cannot find meaning in anything. I cannot even argue for belief in him without already having taken him for granted. And similarly, I contend that you cannot argue against belief in him unless you also first take him for granted. Arguing about God's existence, I hold, is like arguing about air. You may affirm that air exists, and I that it does not. But as we debate the point, we are both breathing air all the time. Van Til says, I'm going to propose to argue that unless God is back of everything, you cannot find meaning in anything. We're at the gut level, ideologically, when it comes to arguing as to whether God exists or not. Everything is affected by that. Everything in one's outlook on life. The nature of life, man himself, the nature of reasoning, evidence, what is real, how we should live. Everything is affected by that. And therefore, when you get to an argument between a theist and a non-theist or an atheist, you pull out all the stops. And the question now is ultimately, can anything be meaningful if what you say is right? And can anything be meaningful if what I say is right? Which position provides the preconditions of intelligibility?
And our argument amounts to this, that the atheist worldview is irrational, and the atheist worldview cannot consistently provide the preconditions of intelligible experience, cannot provide the preconditions of science, cannot provide the preconditions of logic, and cannot provide the preconditions of morality. My argument is that you must choose your worldview, and that the atheist worldview undermines logic, science, and morality, and therefore makes human experience unintelligible. Not just mistaken or wrong, unintelligible. We must learn to do an internal critique of the atheist position. An internal critique in terms of which we show how unintelligible everything becomes on the atheist presupposition. And then we invite our atheist friend to stand on our position to see that in terms of it, science and morality and logic are intelligible. Van Til puts it this way. It is not as though the Reformed apologist should not interest himself in the nature of the non-Christian's method. On the contrary, we should make a critical analysis of it. He should, as it were, join his friend in the use of it. But he should do so self-consciously with the purpose of showing that its most consistent application not merely leads away from Christian theism, but in leading away from Christian theism leads to destruction of reason and science as well. It's one of my most favorite sentences in all of the things Van Til has written. Listen to it again. Why do we join the atheist in using his method, his philosophical approach to things? That we might demonstrate that the application, its most consistent application, not merely leads away from Christian theism, but in leading away from Christian theism leads to the destruction of reason and science as well. Now, you probably like some substance to back that up. I mean, making those claims doesn't automatically show that those claims are true. So what sorts of things do you want to talk to the philosophical professor about that you run into, so that you might show that his whole worldview destroys the intelligibility of experience? Well, I'm going to offer you just a few examples in the time that we have remaining in our first hour here. And I think once you master the kind of argument that I'm talking about, something will dawn on you that is really invigorating, refreshing. And that's that you don't have to be a philosopher. You don't have to be an intellectual in order to be able to answer any man who comes along and challenges the Christian faith. Okay, the example I'll start with is science, natural science. I understand that natural science assumes something about the nature of reality in order for the natural scientist to do his work. And what is, well, there are a number of things actually, but a central presupposition of natural science is what's called the uniformity of nature. Now, there are a lot of other ways I could put that to you. It also assumes that there are such things as event types and not just individual events. There are types of events so that when all the conditions are the same in an experiment, for instance, on Tuesday, you'll get the same outcome as you did when you did the experiment on Monday. Because what happened there was not just an individual chance or random occurrence, but was an event type. It repeats itself then. You can have a repetition of experience, or you can expect nature to prove itself uniform. You put two chemicals together in a test tube and you get an explosion, and you put those same two chemicals together without other factors being changed. 2 days later, you're still going to get an explosion. You stub your toe on Monday night, it's going to be painful. And so on Tuesday night, you're careful not to stub your toe because you expect nature to be uniform. You don't expect that if you stub your toe on Tuesday night, it's going to turn into be the most blessed and wonderful experience of your life instead of being painful. You expect that similar factors are going to bring similar results. You see, but that assumes something about the nature of reality, and that's that it's not random. That what happens in the world historically is not subject, to put it in popular parlance, to chance. But there is, if you will, causality and uniformity in the world. Now, without that assumption, there would be no natural science. Without that assumption, we wouldn't dare put an astronaut into a rocket and try to go through the same procedures that we experimented on and think we could get him to the moon or up in space and back. We'd say, well, we have no assurance that the way things happened last week or last year or 10 years ago is the way things are going to happen now as we blast off this rocket. And who would possibly be so stupid as to go up in a chance universe where everything is random and nobody knows for sure whether the future will be like the past and expect to come back down again? Maybe you will, maybe you won't. Science demands the uniformity of nature. But now we must ask ourselves, in an atheist universe, what right have you to assume the uniformity of nature? We all expect the sun's going to come up tomorrow. Okay? What right has an atheist to assume that the sun's going to come up tomorrow? Now, I know why, as a Christian, apart from the second coming of Jesus Christ, why the sun will come up tomorrow. It will come up tomorrow because my Heavenly Father has made a covenant in terms of which He promises that He'll keep nature uniform. And so the seasons will succeed each other, as God told Noah, in regular succession. There'll be a regularity about the way the natural world operates, because a sovereign God controls it in just that fashion. By the way, you don't have to be told that in terms of a special revelation of God or read it in the Bible. The Scripture indicates that the nature of God is revealed through nature itself to all men. So the reason even unbelieving scientists go about doing their work assuming the uniformity of nature is because they know in their heart of hearts that this universe is made by God, and God is a God of order and not chaos, and can be counted on to keep nature uniform. They do that all the while denying that God, though. And what we want to do then is tear the mask off the sinner's face. We want to say, if you say that this world is not controlled by a Creator God who is providential and keeps nature uniform, then why is it we assume the uniformity of nature? On what basis do we do so? Better yet, not just on what basis, but in terms of your view of chance or the randomness of history, there cannot be a uniformity of nature. I'll give you another example, even more basic than this one about science, and that has to do with all thinking, whether it's natural science or not. All argumentation assumes laws of thought, what we call the rules of logic in freshman classes on the subject. All argumentation assumes that there are rules by which we must coordinate premise to premise to premise to make sure we don't contradict each other, and that our conclusions are consistent with our premises. Now, in an atheist universe, where unless we're dealing, I could change the example if we were dealing with the Eastern world, where there might be somebody who says there is no God and everything is spiritual in nature. But in the Western world, most atheists are naturalists or materialists. They tend to assume everything is material in nature. Now, what are the characteristics of matter? What are the characteristics of the natural world? Well, one of those characteristics is everything is particular rather than general or universal. Okay? In the natural world, there's no such thing as rose nests or the universal rose. But there are rosettes, particular roses, made out of matter in some way. And cows, likewise. There's no cowness in the natural world, but there's a cow here and a cow there. Everything is particular. Everything is tied down to the material instance before your very senses at the moment. However, the laws of logic aren't particular and they aren't materialistic. Unless you want to argue, as some, in order to be consistent, want to argue that the laws of logic are nothing but electrochemical reflexes in the brain of man. But of course, if they are, it doesn't make sense to say they're normative. Because the mind of man just happens to have those electrochemical reactions, but that doesn't make it normative for anybody else, nor does it make it uniform or universal. What happens in my mind whatever's happening in my brain right now as I'm speaking these words, doesn't have anything to say with what may be happening in my brain or what ought to be happening in my brain when I speak other words in a couple of minutes or in a couple of days or a couple of years. You see, there is no universality to material things. And so when people lay down the normative rule that we must obey the laws of logic and tell us we live in an atheist universe, that doesn't hold together. That's inconsistent. That doesn't comport. You cannot say, on the one hand, that everything is particular, materialistic, then on the other hand, say, but all of our thinking about things must be governed by laws of logic which are universal and non-material. The atheist universe cannot provide the preconditions of intelligibility because the atheist universe cannot give us the uniformity of nature for science and cannot give us abstract entities or invariant entities such as the mental laws of logic which are necessary for argumentation. We could, reference was made last night in questions, to the moral argument for God's existence. The atheist will often say, you ought or you ought not to do things. You ought not to settle this argument by shooting me. But you see, when he says that, he's assuming there's such a thing as a moral absolute. But how can you say anything is absolute in a world that's constantly changing? If history is nothing but sound and fury, as Shakespeare would say, signifying nothing then, if history is nothing but random atoms, doing whatever they're doing, there are no moral absolutes to be imposed on people. The atheist universe cannot provide, therefore, what is most necessary for an intelligible understanding of human experience and history, and that's the explanation of ethics. And the fact that we all apply moral absolutes. Even when we apply different ones, it's the fact that we think there's something absolute about what we're saying that doesn't fit into an atheist universe. All right, so what is the argument for God's existence? How is it that you can argue with an atheist and win? You can argue with an atheist and win if you remember that you're defending Christian theism, not general theism, and that you're proposing a rational defense of the objective truth of that Christian theism as a system of thought, in terms of which you recognize the atheist has his presuppositions and worldview, you have your presuppositions and worldview, and the only way to resolve the conflict between them is by inviting the atheist to stand on your point of view and see how it makes sense out of logic, morality, and science. Other things could be mentioned, but I'll leave it at that. And how, in terms of his worldview, he cannot make sense of logic, science, and morality. And then once you realize that, you must doggedly stick to it. Doggedly stick to it. And tell him, as long as he says that there is no God who has made this world, in terms of which there are spiritual or mental invariant realities, in terms of which there is a uniformity to nature, in terms of which there are moral absolutes, every time he utters a sentence, he can be challenged as to the uniformity of nature that he presupposes in uttering that sentence, the laws of logic in terms of which he's reasoning in uttering that sentence, and the moral principles by which he's living as he utters that sentence. You need to show him that he has to live up to his presupposition. Of course, he isn't, and no one ever can. The atheist is constantly living in God's universe, and he knows God, and as Paul says in Romans 1, is suppressing that truth. He suppresses it, but he lives in terms of it. And so atheists become very good logicians sometimes, but they're not good when they're challenged as to the foundations of the laws of logic. Atheists become very good scientists in detailed questions sometimes, but they are terrible philosophers of science when they are challenged as to their presuppositions. Atheists can sometimes do a lot of detailed work even in moral questions, but in our own day and age, we see actually the disintegration of secular and naturalistic ethics to what is basically an analytical position. We can only analyze what we mean by our sentences in ethics because no one can justify moral absolutes. We can only explain what we mean when we apply the word using moral absolutes or pertaining to moral absolutes. Paul's argument in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 amounted to this. Where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Hasn't God made foolish the wisdom of this world?
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and hit the bell notification.
This recording has been released into the public domain by the Bahnsen Institute. Duplication, sharing, and distribution is encouraged. For more information about the life and ministry of Dr. Greg L. Bahnsen, visit our website, bahnseninstitute.com, where we aim to bring into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ.